Good evening and welcome to our program. I'm Elizabeth Golden, the Education Program Coordinator. Tonight's program is on woody biomass from Addison County's private forest enrolled in the Use Value Appraisal Program. Our speaker this evening is Chris Olson, who is the Addison County Forester. Our program is sponsored by the ACORN Renewable Energy Co-op and the Addison County Regional Planning Commission, with additional funding from the Department of Energy. ACORN presents these programs every month, usually on the third Wednesday, and we welcome you to attend any of our programs. And also, they will be uploaded onto the Middlebury Community TV website. You can find all of our programs that we've been presenting. So without further ado, we'll welcome Chris Olson.
Thank you. Very kind of you, thank you. So I just want to thank ACORN for asking me to do this. It's very nice of them. I've been in Addison County for 5 or 6 years now, and feel like I'm starting to get my feet underneath me. And so it's good to have an opportunity to do these things. It takes a long time to get to know a county, especially if you want to walk off of lawns through the regenerating meadow and then into the forest. There's a lot of land to get to know, and it's very enjoyable and entertaining to meet the people who own it and spend time with them. So just as a brief introduction, I'd want to just tell you a little bit about myself. Again, my name's Chris Olson. I work for the State of Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation as the Addison County Forester. Previous to being employed as the Addison County Forester, I lived in Paulet, Vermont, down in the Meadowy Valley, and worked as a private consulting forester for 17 years down there, which means that I worked in sort of a similar industry, if I can use that term, similar players that I engaged with, as I do now, private forest landowners, logging contractors, mill owners, ecologists, natural resource professionals. And so my experience in Vermont spans a couple decades now. And I'm glad to be working here in Addison County in this capacity. When I lived in Paulet, much of my work was in Bennington County, and I got to know the Bennington County Forester down there quite well. I worked as a private consulting forester at Merck Forest, just hired by them to manage their forest land. I wasn't an employee of theirs, but that's an educational institution, nonprofit that does a variety of land-based educational programs, and that's where I really started to get to know the county forester in Bennington, whose name was Jim White. He's retired now. And I used to, in doing workshops down there, I often teamed up with Jim to do educational programs, and I used to introduce myself as a private consulting forester at that time, and then I would introduce Jim White as the Bennington County Forester and tell people that he'd been the Bennington County Forester as long as I've been alive. And he always looked at me a little bit unsure whether that was a compliment or not, because he'd been Bennington County Forester for about 30 years. And it meant a lot to me getting to know him because he was good at what he did. He was a very effective communicator. He was pleasant, I think, most of the time in most situations, despite having had 3 decades of working in that industry and that business, which has its trials and tribulations for sure. But so that was sort of what set me off in thinking that working as a public servant rather than as a private contractor would be a good step to take, and I'm pleased and glad that I made that choice or had the opportunity and was hired, and I'm pleased to be a public servant here in Addison County. And so some of you I have met in that capacity, and I appreciate you guys coming tonight. It's very nice of you. And others I might meet in the future, I guess, out somewhere beyond where the lawn ends, is what I always suggest. And so tonight I've been asked to talk about a couple different topics, but I think what I'm going to spend most of the night talking about, or the evening talking about, is the Use Value Appraisal Program, which is also known as Current Use. Are there people who are unaware of what that program is, or is most everyone aware of it? So there's some that are unaware. Yeah. I'll spend some time describing sort of broad details of the program. So the intent, I think it was in 1980 that the program was first established, was to keep Vermont's agricultural and forest land in production. And so the idea it was to tax land in such a way, or have land appraised in such a way that the land could be kept in production, rather than have it taxed in such a way that it was appraised at its fair market value. And so that was one of the primary incentives. And so you can see on this slide the idea. In 2012, there's a body of people, the Current Use Advisory Board, that meet to discuss, argue, come up with what that use value rate is. And so the forest use value in 2012 is $123 an acre. And so every acre of land that's enrolled in the forest land program is appraised then at $123 per acre. And the town's tax rate is charged against that value. And so as you can imagine, if some of you are familiar with what your appraisal is on a per acre basis, it can be a substantial savings for people who are enrolled in the program. The agricultural use value, which is set there this year, it's $254 an acre, is part of the agricultural use value appraisal program, which I have nothing to do with, really. I do monitor some of the enrollment. Just as trees grow on former agricultural land, it becomes forested, and so I periodically make efforts to ensure that land is appropriately enrolled in the agricultural program. But generally, the agricultural program has much less oversight than the forest land program. And so this slide spells out some of the intents of the programs that the program has. Again, initially it was established to keep land from being developed due to the way it was appraised. And I'm just going to read now from, this is a copy of the application that must be filed for enrollment in the program. There's a couple things on the application that I often read to people, some of whom had filed the application some years ago, who may not have remembered some of these details. And so the purpose of this program is to keep productive agricultural and forest land in production and help to slow the development of these lands. When a landowner enrolls land in the program, he or she is making a long-term commitment to manage the land according to accepted farm, forest, and conservation practices. And so that's does a really good job in a few sentences of spelling out the intent of the program. The other sentence that I often read to people who are enrolled as part of my administration of the program for the people of the state of Vermont who fund it is this section of the application, which is right above where they have signed, which says, when this application is signed by the landowners and approved by the state, it shall be recorded in the land records of the municipality and shall constitute a lien to secure payment of the land use change tax to the municipality upon development of the parcel. The lien shall run with the land. And so I've read this to a few landowners who then stare at me for a moment and then say, I didn't know that. And I say, well, I'm reading it from the application that has your signature right below that statement. And so it carries some real teeth, you know, if you think about it in that way as a lien to secure payment of the land use change tax. And so it's important to recognize what's happening when you enroll land in the program. The lien runs with the land, and so it will be either passed on to your heirs or assigns or transferred in the sale of a property. And that is, again, part of the legislation. It was part of the decision-making when the program was initially established to benefit the not just the landowner, but the land, and that long-term commitment in the investment that the people of the state of Vermont are making in each of those parcels that's enrolled. Yes, sir?
I think you said long-term commitment. Is that sort of in perpetuity? I mean, how?
Yes.
Is that, I mean, can you define that further?
Yes, I'll read it, that one sentence again. Again, this is on the application. The lien shall run with the land, which means that any heir, any assign, any purchaser of that land is purchasing the land with that lien intact. And the lien is to secure payment of the land use change. The lien is held by the people of the state of Vermont who fund the program to secure payment of the land use change tax upon development of the parcel, upon mismanagement of the parcel, or upon the desire of the landowner to clear the lien. And there might be other reasons too that could happen. But those are the three, I think, most common reasons that lien is paid. And in some cases, it's paid in part because the kid that they thought was going to go away someday decides to stay. And they're going to, you know, look at the zoning requirements in that town, that local area, to determine how that could happen. And so it might be that the zoning is 5 acres, and so they're going to pay a penalty to clear the lien on that 5 acres. And so there's flexibility, but the intent is to make it so that the investment that the people of the state of Vermont make is you know, held in good trust, essentially. So, I'm not going to read each of these. I think that it's...
Just a quick follow-up then.
Yes, of course.
So it's pretty similar to selling development rights. When a property owner might sell development rights on their land, that's something different. So, for instance, the land trust purchases agricultural development rights and so on. So this is just registered differently through the state, but the net effect is that in perpetuity, henceforth, forever and ever kind of, and people try and argue ignorance and try and get out of it for various reasons.
Right. I think it's similar. I think it's not a poor analogy for sure to compare those. The difference is the holder of the lien, right? Is that in some cases, and with land trust, the holder of the lien is a 501c3 in the business of conserving land. So they have a specific intent. In this case, it's the people of the state of Vermont who hold the lien. And we, collectively, also have specific intent, which is described in the legislation, and can change, can vary, I think, and is debated certainly widely at kitchen tables and in state capitol buildings, I think. Yes, sir.
Well, I think, though, to clarify, this does not preserve land in perpetuity. People can get out of the program by paying the land use change tax. That's not the same as a conservation easement.
Right, held by a 501c3,
So
a land
it's
trust
not,
or something.
it's not the same. We might wish it were the same, but it's not.
Well, that's what I was trying to establish, that one could exit the program.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, that's right, yeah. And so it's certainly different, although, of course, some of the land that's held by the land trust is then sold, and it depends on how the deed language is written in those arrangements as well. Yes?
Actually, two quick questions. The amount that is paid, does that change annually? The rates for what the value of the land is?
It is analyzed annually. So the Current Use Advisory Board, which is, I think, a group of 12 individuals named in the legislation, described in the legislation, meet and come up with what those figures are. This is the manual that exists for the program. And they haven't changed greatly over the years. Or I should say they don't change, the rates don't change greatly from year to year. And so in 1980, let's see here, the valuation of an acre of forest land for a period of 10 years, there were valuations done by site quality, by productivity, which is no longer carried out. But so in 1980, an acre of forest land was valued at $60. And today, today it's 123. In 2001, it was valued at $103. So that's when it finally, in 2001, is when that value of an acre of forest land exceeded $100.
Okay.
And so it hasn't changed. In my mind, it's been pretty stable, which is interesting and perhaps really important and relevant to understand, as it relates to the ownership of that land. To know that you could have owned an acre of forest land since 1980 and not have the valuation of that land change dramatically as the real estate markets swung, wildly or increased. I think it's, that says something, is that it's, that stability is meaningful to the program and to the intent of the program.
Part two of that question was, you said that acceptable management practices.
Mm-hmm.
So once you sign that, is there any, can those acceptable management practices, do those change over time, or can one change them? Say somebody decides to start growing fungi as a business versus doing something with the wood in terms of biomass. Is there any flexibility in the program for changing the management practice?
That's what this talk is about.
Oh, goody. Okay.
And there is flexibility, but there is also structure. I wouldn't say that there isn't requirements that will define how your land might be used within certain parameters should you enroll an acre of forest land. You know, there is definition certainly to the requirements. But there's one program for all the landowners in the state of Vermont. And I always spread my arms really wide when I say that. Because if you can imagine the variation in the ownership objectives in the state of Vermont for forest land, it is very broad. And this is one program for all of those owners. And so part of my job, I feel, is to not reach out. You know, I reach out and try to make sure that all those people have the opportunity to be enrolled in this program and to have their objectives met. But there is definition, for sure. But there's flexibility. There's a lot of variation. If you can imagine just, perhaps in this crowd right here or in every town meeting, hall, whatever, there's a lot of variation and there's a lot of people enrolled in the program. And so it certainly is, there's flexibility. And there's been increasing flexibility over the years. And as this talk will demonstrate, I hope. Yes?
I'd like to ask a very practical question. If I wanted to buy an acre of woodland, I wouldn't get it for $123 these days. What would I have to pay? Some example.
It depends, right? And so if you were buying, forested land in Addison County, a parcel that was large enough to enroll in this program, so 25 acres, or, larger, 2,500 acres, there would be variation from that 25 to the 2,500 in the per acre price, likely. But I think that an acre of forest land, there's probably someone here who knows this better than I do right now, but I think an acre of forest land would probably range in price from $500 to $1,500. And then someone out there might be thinking that's out of whack, because I think there's also some land that is a lot more expensive than that. And so it depends. And I'll try not to say those two words too often tonight, but
It sounds like a real bargain, actually.
yeah, it depends on what you're
if you
buying.
think about the carbon footprint reduction you get with 1 acre of woodland by comparison with buying a solar panel, this is a whole lot cheaper than buying a solar panel.
Right, yes. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I've heard this, what I would call confusion of two things before. It's not the sale value that this is being taxed at, it's the use value, meaning what can you produce from it, what kind of income can you get from this land, which is the basis for the taxation. So the whole idea is to tax it at a rate that is not what its fair market value is. If you taxed it at its fair market value, the tax would be much higher. But because you are using it for productive purposes, either as woody biomass or, in the case of open land, to raise corn or for other agricultural purposes, it's taxed. The idea is to tax it at the value that you actually use it for.
Yes. And the current use advisory board actually has there's a formula. It's not just 12 people sitting in a room arguing about what the value should be. There's actually a formula. There's math involved. And so it's based upon, specific commodity prices and various things that can be analyzed. And then there is some subjective nature to the process. But it is, I often, when this is presented in various information that I send to people who are interested in the program, and they're often shocked, I guess, would be the way to describe it, as to what that might mean to them to enroll land in the program. But it is a real commitment. There's, as you'll see, it's not without its purposeful meaning. So to begin with, the eligibility requirements. This is for the forest land program. You need at least 25 acres of land with a minimum of 20 acres of productive forest, managed forest. You also need to file a forest management plan to the minimal acceptable standards, which periodically evolve, of course, as the programs changed and time has passed and understanding of natural features become more known, then the forest management plan requirements have changed. Recently, 2006, I believe it was, there are now allowances for ecologically significant treatment areas to be enrolled, what are referred to as ESTAs in this slide, which include, I'll get into this more, but for an example would be like vernal pools, as well as special significant wildlife habitats, special places, which might be like a cemetery, something like that. And in addition, as it describes here, Site 4 lands, the Site 1, 2, and 3 forest land relates to soil site quality. And so Site 1 are lands that have the highest soil productivity. Site 4 lands have the lowest soil site productivity. And so aside from some of these ecologically significant treatment areas, now with this new portion of this legislation, all Site 4 lands are eligible. And so it used to be, prior to the new legislation, that only 20% of the enrolled land could be Site 4 lands. And recently that has changed. The legislation changed that to allow unlimited Site 4 lands enrolled, so long as there's a minimum of Site 1, 2, or 3 lands. And I'll get into this a little bit more in a later slide. And so the forest management plans are written to cover a 10-year period. This is what the county forester in every county reviews and signs on behalf of the people of the state of Vermont who are funding the program. And so the forest management plans are generally written by a private consulting forester who is hired by a landowner. They cover a 10-year period. They're intended to, again, there's a structure and form that is provided by the state, although the form is not required to be used by the landowner, so long as they meet the minimum requirements that are described in sort of the plan template, they can develop their own forest management plan. And the private consulting foresters that are hired by the landowners often have their own format. And we'll look at that a little bit later, how these might vary. But so the plans are required to describe the ownership goals. Again, within the context of the program, describe the forest conditions. They include inventory data, which would mean like hard metrics about forest composition, diameter, class distribution, species composition, various product grades, so saw timber products, cordwood products. So there's hard metrics that are provided as part of the written forest management plan. The plans also then must describe the management objectives, again, which would fit within the context of the program, but might have special characteristics that would allow perhaps what might be considered non-traditional forest products. And so I would say, to answer your question about, I think you asked about like shiitake mushrooms or?
I didn't say shiitake.
Right, mushroom, right. Yep, and so certainly I would read and review a plan that could have that language in it, and I might have a lot of questions about how that would occur. Again, if you think about the intent of the program, some of the original legislation, or the original intent of the legislation, the purpose of the program is to keep productive agriculture and forest land in production and help to slow the development of these lands. And so that, again, that's, I always say that's the third sentence on the application. And it's subject to interpretation, right, if you read that. And so a landowner might present an argument to me, and the county foresters aren't given a lot of flexibility in interpretation. The intent is to have the program administered evenly throughout all the counties for the people of the state of Vermont. But I would certainly listen to that sort of request and see how it would fit in. And again, I'm trying to figure out, so what does that mean to the people of the state of Vermont? That's like part of my job is to try to figure out, so is this going to satisfy the requirements of the program? What would the people of the state of Vermont think about that sort of activity? Because again, it's both ecological and economical intent in the original legislation. And so back to the forest management plans, the management objectives can be quite variable. The detailed treatment information, so that is describing basically what activities are going to occur during that 10-year period of enrollment. And oftentimes, or there's requirements to reference guides that exist, published guides. And so that's the sort of thing that I look for, and we keep a list. There's a list of accepted guides that are established that we add to periodically as new information comes in. And so then the final requirement is the map that meets standards, and both forest land enrollments and agricultural land enrollments are required to file a map, and I've brought a couple copies in here that I'll hold up to give you an idea of the standards. The scale of the maps is set at 1 to 5,000, and so that is a requirement for all the maps that are presented to the tax department, who receive a copy of the map, and the county foresters. And so this is an example of a map for a forest land enrollment. It has these 4 tick marks, as they're referred to, which basically are part of the Vermont coordinate system, so it allows me to fix this map in space, essentially. And so then the other components are a location map. This says Little Lemon Fair River, and so it helps to cause me to be found when I look at this map. Yes.
So if I understand this, you make a plan for a 10-year period. And for example, if you approved something that was less traditional, say a fungi operation, after that 10 years, say somebody comes in that's a different forester, would that argument have to be made again? Or would the management plan be able to continue? I mean, if you weren't doing something that was traditionally in the forest management plan.
Yeah, I think that it would come out in the discussion for sure as to how the requirements of the program could be described, or how the intent, the objectives of your management could be described to meet the intent of the program. And so I think that there might be activities that we would tailor for production of, what you're describing, mushrooms that could be written into a forest management plan. It would, to me, it would depend upon the extent of the production to a certain degree. So if you wanted to roll 100 acres, and we're going to have 2 acres of shiitake mushroom production, but you wanted to enroll all the acres, the other 98, but not have any forest management activities conducted, then that might be a stretch, right?
And one last...
Because the intent is, again, to keep that productive land in production. And so I would need to understand how is that other 98 acres in production, essentially.
Would production possibly include educational enterprises, as in using the forest for educational purposes?
It wouldn't exclude them, but it wouldn't probably meet the requirements of the program.
Okay, thanks.
So this is just another example of a map that, again, meets the standards. A little bit more technologically advanced. It's just a moment in time, basically. Some of the plans were written really before digital mapping was as common. And so I have more and more plans and maps coming across my desk that provide this sort of format. And it's useful so long as the imagery is relatively recent. Yes.
So I have some questions about the amount of land that is in this program and what kind of resources are being harvested from the program. Do you have an idea about what kind of acreage is in there, what percentage of it is, and how much timber is being brought out of the lands that are participating in this program?
I do. I don't have that handy and ready as part of this presentation, I'm afraid. And so let me just look to see. I think there might be acreage figures that are part of the description process. What happens every year is that the every year landowners who have an activity on their property must file what's referred to as a forest management activity report. And so those activity reports are duplicate copies. One copy is held in the county forester office, and the other copy is sent to the tax department. The copy that is sent to the tax department has Social Security number, federal ID number, and so it links then that activity on that particular property to an entity, a person or a business that owns that property. And you can, I think some of you might understand why this might happen. And so landowners who are enrolled in the program who are benefiting from the use value appraisal are asked then, if they carry out a forest management activity of some sort, harvesting, to report that activity so that the tax department knows that they're actually filing as part of their income tax any income that they might have had from that activity. And of course, again, as a person who administers this program in Addison County, it's really important to me that I make sure that the people of Addison County who are funding the program are having things adequately reported by those who are enrolled.
Do you have any sense of what, and I'm not asking for specific numbers because obviously it sounds like you don't have those right now, but biomass is getting utilized for chip products and things like that, say for the college biomass plant, or to go down to
Rygate or Burlington Electric or any
or
other
to
number.
the Vermont wood pellets for
Yeah,
there.
yeah. I don't understand based on the reporting the end point. Who's receiving that biomass. But I do understand on an annual basis the tons of chips that are reported as part of a forest management activity report, or they might be reported as cords. And so I do have that information. Again, I didn't make it part of this presentation, but I can provide you in the manual for the whole state. Let's see here. This is a little bit of information. In 2008, there were 1,594,000 acres enrolled statewide. And that's just of forest land. And the reimbursements that year were 9,700,000. And so that spells out one end of that equation. But so there is ways, and there's reporting done by the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, not on an annual basis, but we're in the midst of compiling another 10 years of information about that particular question, basically, is what is the program amounting to, basically, in terms of wood product flow off of these lands. And there's some interesting historical information about that topic that I could unearth for you. So let's see, I'll carry on here. So I showed you a couple of the plans. This is just an example of the existing plan template which exists. This is, again, part of the manual. This stuff is online, which I can provide you with the web page where you might find this information. And so, again, there are landowners and private consulting foresters who use this template. And then, of course, there are other private consulting foresters that provide all the information that is necessary in the template, but they follow their own format, which is, of course, interesting for an administrator because I have to read through each different format to figure out whether or not they have actually met the requirements. But
Chris, that's in the handout too, the format.
oh, good.
It's in the handouts.
Okay. So I'll go through some of this rather quickly. So the sections of a forest management plan include the property summary, which might include landowner's name, the address, the physical address, some of the tax ID numbers, the SPAN, school property account number, that sort of information. The resource information, just sort of generally. And then finally, the stand description. And a stand is like a population of trees of like species characteristics or age characteristics. And so each property is broken into several different stands or one or two stands. And that unit is then described. And that's the unit that I I review for the landowners and for the forest managers to make sure that they're following good science, basically. Part of the requirements of the program are that certain soil and water resource parameters or information are met. There's acceptable management practices for protecting water quality, which are state laws, or a group of state laws, have a heightened requirement if or when land is enrolled in the program. And so this little book here, which is, the title is Acceptable Management Practices for Maintaining Water Quality on Logging Jobs in Vermont. And so it's made small like this, so it might fit into the glove compartment of a logging contractor's pickup truck or a consulting forester's vehicle or pocket or cruising vest. And so these are important. There's not a lot of laws that are embedded in this program that one finds themselves involved with when you sign that application, that lien. But this group of practices become really sort of a matter of law once the land is enrolled. And so on all logging jobs in the state of Vermont, acceptable management plan or acceptable management practices are required if there's a violation of a water quality law, which means basically that if there's a discharge of sediment, dirt, into the surface waters of the state of Vermont that are held in trust for the people of the state of Vermont. And so if you're operating a logging job on your property and you discharge sediment into that waterway, these acceptable management practices come into play. If you have these acceptable management practices in place on your logging job and there's a discharge, there's no violation. You just have to figure out how to stop that discharge. On land that's enrolled in the use value appraisal program, these acceptable management practices must be in place regardless of whether there's a discharge into the waterways of the state of Vermont. And so basically the bar is raised once you file the application, have the management plan certified by the county forester, then these become required during logging jobs on your property. And so it's basically a heightened requirement. And they carry teeth. That county forester that I mentioned earlier, or Bennington County Forester, when I walk around on properties with him that I was managing during a logging job, and we would, typically in Vermont, if you're logging in the woods in Vermont, there's water somewhere, and it's not uncommon to have some issue related to 25,000-pound four-wheel tired vehicles rolling around in the woods where it doesn't happen very often, and you have water around. And so Jim White, the Bennington County Forester, he always had a way of describing things to people that I thought was really useful. And I heard him once say to someone when we were out on doing like an inspection on a job that I was sort of administering. I had marked the timber and hired the logging contractor for the landowner, and there was some problems along a river, and he said to the landowner, who is ultimately responsible, he said, there's two numbers you have to remember. The first one's 10,000, because it takes 10,000 years for our forests, our deciduous forests, to build an inch of topsoil from leaf litter. And then he said, and the second number is 10,000. I was like, Jim, that's like one number twice. But he was getting his point across because these acceptable management practices for protecting water quality come with penalties if you don't follow them, and there's a discharge into the state's waterways. And so he said, again, there's two numbers you have to remember, and the first one's 10,000 because it takes a year to build 10,000 years to build an inch of topsoil. And then he said in the second number's 10,000 because the penalties for discharging that topsoil into the state's waterways are $10,000 a day. Up to $10,000 a day for each day of violation, or fines up to $25,000. To my knowledge, there's never been a violation that has caused that sort of penalty, a $10,000 penalty, but there certainly has been AMP violations that have caused a penalty. But it's a good thing to remember, and it's important issue, of course, because our forest productivity is based upon the soils. And so it's really important to keep as I describe it, the dirt up on the hill. Don't put it down in the brook. Irene, did a good job of putting dirt and a lot of other things downstream a ways. And I've been on a lot of properties in Addison County following Irene, some of which had all their AMPs in place, all their acceptable management practices for protecting water quality in place. And those roads, trails, infrastructure were pretty solid. And I've been on other properties where things didn't fare so well. Irene was a little bit of a odd or unusual storm, of course, and so it really tested things for sure. Anyways, so the soil and water resources are important portions of the forest management plan, if at the very least that they will acknowledge to the landowner that these exist and they're important to pay attention to when you're logging on your property. And so I ask all the consulting foresters that write forest management plans to, at the very least, reference this book so that landowners are aware that that happens. Yes?
Hi. Sometimes people say that they will only buy wood from sustainably harvested lands. Mm-hmm. Do you ever get asked to certify that something is sustainably harvested?
Well, I certify all the use value appraisal plans in Addison County again, as a public servant. And
so do you think they all
that's one way I might answer that question. There's other bodies of organizations that describe themselves as creating standards around sustainable forestry. The Rainforest Alliance, Smartwood, Sustainable Forestry Initiative, that's sort of like what's on the menu this year. And so the important thing, I think, is to understand, if you're a landowner, what it is you're involving yourself with, just like, with this program. So the state of Vermont doesn't sell this program in that way. We have, again, the people of the state of Vermont haven't asked the legislatures to develop a branding in Vermont based upon this program. And I don't know how that might happen, whether that would, whether there'd be the political will to sort of brand this program in that way. Yes?
Would you say that the practices that are required in this program are sustainable?
Yes. Yeah. I would say that it's uncommon, in my experience, to have properties that are enrolled in the program conduct activities which result in them being removed from the program because of unsustainable practices. That said, it's certainly open to discussion or debate as to what those might be.
What sustainable means.
Yeah,
Are you familiar with some of the other rating programs out there?
Yep.
To compare similarities
Yeah.
between this program and those, and
Yep.
there's significant similarities?
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities, I would think. Yeah. And so the bar is pretty high, really. I believe the bar is pretty high. It's certainly been, I think, in a lot of people's minds, increasing. The requirements for both the administration and the on-the-ground work have been increasing. I'm going to move on, carry on. So these other, the recreation and aesthetics, the cultural resources, and the wildlife habitat for the use value appraisal program are optional components of the forest management plan. For those landowners that choose to describe these characteristics and resources on their property, they are then making their plans eligible for other cost share funding that usually occurs through the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And so those three categories are sort of piggybacked on the use value appraisal program at this time to allow those plans, these plans that would include those, to be then eligible for cost shares through the NRCS. Which again, this is one of those sort of debatable things as to whether or not that should just be a requirement for the use value appraisal program. And so far, it hasn't made it to that point. There's other things that certainly have that we'll get into a little bit more. So this follows these next sections I've talked a little bit about already. But I'll just get into them a little bit more. So again, the soils are the basis for the productivity. And so we use soil surveys to determine site quality, essentially, which are then, that's transferred then to the productivity of the forests. And so there's other characteristics that are also described often in some of the forest management plans: vernal pools, riparian areas, which I'll get into a little bit more, each of those categories. And then, like up in this corner, this might be what would be described as Site 4 lands, and so that's, flooded land as a result of beaver activity, and so it's not necessarily static situation. That land would fluctuate in its productivity depending upon how active the beaver populations are. Again, this is one of the portions that I described earlier that is not required to be part of the use value appraisal plan, but it does, if it is included in the forest management plans, then those landowners would be eligible for cost shares that otherwise they wouldn't be. Same with the cultural resources. In some cases, and I'll get into this a little bit more, the cultural resources might be included in the most recent category of enrollment, which are ecologically significant treatment areas, which specify cultural resources. Previously, this sort of feature might be included in enrollment, or a landowner would have this on their property, but they wouldn't want to do productive forest management like logging in the vicinity of these things. Now these things can actually be identified and enrolled and protected as part of the forest management plan. Similarly with the wildlife habitat, so describing this sort of feature in the use value appraisal forest management plan would then allow that land or that landowner to be eligible for other cost share funding opportunities that are outside of the use value appraisal program. All these features, the wildlife habitat, the cultural resources, all of those things must also then be identified on a map as well. So I'm going to get into, again, a little bit more about the specifics of the land use categories. For the program that I'm the administrator of, again, in Addison County, the primary enrollment is of lands that are managed for timber, and they use existing Forest Service silvicultural guides. And so these are guides which are like technical documents. This is sort of this is the most commonly used one in the Northeast. And so this is the silvicultural guide for northern hardwood types in the Northeast. It's referred to as NE 603 by any forester wonk out there who works in the Northeast. It has been revised and updated, but so this publication came out of studies from the late 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s in places like Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, the experimental, I'm just losing the name, experimental forest in the Adirondacks that's run by the SUNY schools. And so there's like hard science that has basically gone into that sort of guide making that's been then amended over time. And so there's a whole series of Forest Service silvicultural guides for different forest types that must be referenced in forest management plans for lands that are managed for timber. There's also some latitude for using guides other than these Forest Service guides. And so it just involves, again, there's some sort of communication, understanding, presentation by a landowner with some basis for what that might be. And those guides have been then absorbed by the department as being meaningful guides that others can use as well. And so the, again, the program was started in the 80s, and fairly recent, I think it was 2005, there were some rather dramatic changes in the program. And so the, I think that what we're going to talk about next is, I would say probably one of the greatest changes was in recognizing that almost every parcel that could be enrolled has some land on it that really isn't suited for timber management, for traditional timber management. And for many years, county foresters, administrators of the program would be visiting, doing an inspection on a property, and they'd run into some feature on the landscape or have a conversation with a landowner, which would lead them either lead the county forester to suggesting something like, so you're not going to put the skidders down here, are you? Asking that question. Or the landowner would be sort of, stiff and not sure if they really wanted to go around that bend in the river or something or up over the hill because they knew that land was enrolled in the forest land program, but they really didn't want to put equipment over there. And so in many cases, this was situations where I had found myself in where I would describe, either not want to describe something and or ask a landowner to describe something that really wouldn't fit into the requirements of the program. And so oftentimes it might be like a riparian area that was below pine hemlock forest that I would then find myself thinking, boy, it might make sense to keep equipment out of that area. You might work in the upper stretches of it where the road runs, but not drop the equipment down into that riparian area. And landowners might be asking me this question. And historically, or before this particular law came into effect, there were, I would just say, well, don't make a polygon on the map that would show this area and say that I'm not going to do any forest management down there. Don't tell me that. Just lump it into the adjacent area and then don't put equipment down there. And it became known amongst the county foresters and the consulting foresters and some landowners who were involved in this sort of thing as what was referred to as the wink and nod. And so we would say to a landowner, all right, if you're going to separate that polygon out and tell me that you're not going to do anything down there, then I'm not going to be able to sign that plan because the rules of the program don't allow that. But if you just lump it in with the adjacent area, and then when the time comes you don't put equipment down there, you just work in the more operable area, then everything will be fine. And this happened, for a couple decades, years, and finally it was decided that they would actually, or the legislature, I think, decided that they would take the opportunity to actually codify this, make it so that it was part of the program. And so these ecologically significant treatment areas, as they're referred to as ESTAs, became part of the program. And so we'll get into that a little bit more, what some of those features might be. And so then there's also lands not managed active for timber miscellaneous, which have some limitations as to what extent of that of your enrolled or what extent of an enrolled parcel can be in those categories. And then lands not managed actively for timber is another category which are referred to as Site 4, which is again a productivity class. And so that might include like Cornwall Swamp or the ledges of Snake Mountain, that sort of thing. And so that land can go into the program, but because of its low productivity, it doesn't have to be described and managed for timber. So again, I'll just go through these rather quickly since we've talked about them a fair amount. So these are the original category of forest land enrollments were lands managed for timber on these class 1, 2, or 3 sites, which are based on soil productivity. And this was the primary UV enrollment and still is today except for the ag enrollment. It can include sugar bush management. And then another category is the lands not managed for timber, or lands managed for timber but not using existing silvicultural guides. And so that would include significant wildlife habitats like deer wintering areas, mass stands, for beech nuts primarily, bat habitats, which is certainly relevant here in the Champlain Valley and Addison County in particular. Corridors, which might be like travel corridors, rookeries for herons and that sort of thing. Special places and sensitive sites might be unique geological, cultural, or ecological sites. And so again, these are specific features on a property that a landowner might identify. Waterfalls, gorges, eskers, all these things now, instead of just being lumped into the productive forest land category, can be designated outside of that category as these special treatment areas. So another category, as I described earlier, are these ecologically significant treatment areas. And so I'll get in a little bit more detail about what those things might include. Again, there's limitations on those things. On that type of enrollment. It cannot exceed 20% of the productive lands. So when this legislation was passed, it was during the previous administration. The Douglas administration is when this legislation was added to the program. And of course, when the legislation comes into that arena, it gets tinkered with a little bit, and so that this level was set, this 20% level was set, which again, from an administrator of the program, it kind of puts the county foresters back in the same situation of this wink and nods reality, because a land ownership, whatever it might be, 150 acres, when the landowner bought it, they didn't do the math, the analysis of this 20% of productive 1, 2, and 3 land. And so there are still, again, properties that are enrolled in the program that, to me, you know, again, an administrator of the program, sort of meet the general requirements of the program, but they have lands that are in excess of this 20% of productive land. And so it puts, again, it puts the administrators back in the you know, in that situation where it's like, well, just lump it in with the other thing, or we define it and we exclude it from the program. It depends really on, you know, we give the landowners that, you know, it's that choice. You can't have more than 20% of your land enrolled as an ecologically significant treatment area. So there's limitations to that, and that was like a, you know, a political decision essentially. That enrollment of those lands, the ecologically significant treatment areas, still might require some management. It's not necessarily always like laissez-faire sort of reality. It could be that you have to control the buckthorn on that ecologically significant treatment area, or you know, do something to create or favor habitat for the Indiana bat, for example. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no activities conducted or going to be conducted. And so the 6 types of this new category, these ecologically significant treatment areas, and again, I want to sort of make sure that you understand that this wasn't something that came from the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. This came from the people. It was like handed to the legislatures to ensure that this program would allow for this type of recognition. And so the 6 types include the natural communities of statewide significance, which might include, like, as an example, Cornwall Swamp. You know, deer leap, there's, you know, specific features. Rare, threatened, endangered species, their habitats essentially, and so that might be like Indiana bat here in Addison County. Riparian areas, again, I run into this in Addison County here along, you know, Lewis Creek, Little Otter Creek, all the tributaries to those rivers, New Haven River, all of that. And, you know, again, in many cases, I find that, you know, the old situation, like the whole wink and nod thing, this just makes so much more sense to be able to actually designate these things. The other interesting thing, or thing I should mention, is that these designations don't carry the same force as the lien. And so if I bought a property that was enrolled in the program that didn't have any of these things categorized, defined, I could then define them myself on a new map and a new plan. Or vice versa, if I bought a property that had these things defined, but I didn't want to have them as part of an updated plan, I could change that. And so they don't have that same like force of law as the actual application. Yes, sir.
Chris, you mentioned the New Haven River, riparian areas, and let me understand that on my property, that's populated mostly by box elder and some very nice sycamores. Mm-hmm. It has ecological value and in a floodplain, but what does one do with that? Just clear out the dead wood that
Yeah.
comes every once in a while with the floods and.
Yeah. When I first became Addison County Forester, it was before this ESTA legislation. And so I had an opportunity to interact in a few cases with landowners who were going through that sort of wink and nod thing, or I was asking them, don't put that on the map and tell me you're not going to do anything there, lump it in with, so I'd been through that sort of thing. And one place where it occurred was at the mouth of Otter Creek. What is that? Kellogg Bay? Is that what that is right there? Where it wraps around. I don't know if you ever been on the water or canoed out from Virgins out there. It's like this really cool place where the river, it swings to the, out to the lake, and then it heads north, and then pretty soon, if you were to stand up in your canoe, you'd realize that the lake is like right there, 50 feet, 100 feet, 150 feet, through this little forested, I don't know what you'd call that, like isthmus or something, from all the sediments over the eons that have dumped out of the river, essentially.
So estuary.
Right. I guess that would be, is that the name of that landform?
No, that.
Right. Anyways, it's like really something, and it's similar sort of forest. I walked around on it and I was like, holy cow, and I remember the landowner at the time, it was enrolled in the forest land program, and all I could think, the other cool features that there is there some historic feature from the Revolutionary War. There were boats anchored at the mouth of that, and some of the Green Mountain Boys, dragged a boat somehow across the land or from Otter Creek, and they dug a canal through the woods, actually like dug this canal so that the British out there, sleepy watching the mouth of the river, weren't paying attention to what was going on behind them. And they got blasted, I guess, by, these like crazy Green Mountain Boys that had shovels, essentially. And when I was walking around, I walked out there and we got there and I was like, how are we going to get across this? And we found like a downed tree and we walked across the thing and I was looking around, I was like, what the heck is that? And it's still there. Like that canal is still there that was dug. But so anyways, this feature was out there. And I remember asking them, so what are you going to do out here? Hoping that they were going to tell me like almost nothing, is what I was sort of hoping to hear. It was enrolled in the forest land program. And all I asked them to do was to pick up the trash because it was sort of odd, it was like all that stuff would wash in basically from both directions, I think. And so in that particular case, that is like a really classic ESTA, an ecological significant treatment area. And it's a riparian area for sure. And it might be some of these other things. Like in your case, it might be a natural community of statewide significance as well. We'd have to investigate that.
I'm thinking of it as a possible source for biomass. It grows quickly, dies a lot, and if it could be pulled out of there, it's about the same density as pine, which they
So
make
this is the
pellets out
willow?
of.
Or
No, these box elders.
box elders, right. Yeah, that's interesting.
Thousands of them on my property.
And so the sixth type is old forests, which again, these have limitations as to how they would be, what is a definition of that, and also then how much can be enrolled. I'm going to try to go through these quickly. These are some just photographic examples, and so that's like Limestone Bluff on Lake Champlain, so that is forest land. But again, as an administrator of the program and as a citizen, it's like, all right, so do we want to mandate productive forest management on that sort of acreage? And this is a situation where this this ESTA legislation, this new legislation, really makes sense. The next image is of a dry hickory hop hornbeam forest, which is, again, it's forest land. Down where I came from in Paulet, this was fairly common on the south slopes of the Taconic Mountains there, and I used to always describe it as sort of holding the rest of the world together. Yes, sir?
Aren't there, like what Peter was talking about along the New Haven River where he's got land and on Lake Champlain there, aren't there requirements for setback of harvesting of timber near waterways and bodies of water in the management plans? You're not allowed to, because, you know, the whole thing about erosion and deposition in waterways.
I don't know of any specific laws that would regulate that. Again, there are water quality, those acceptable management practices for protecting water quality. Those practices have to be in place, but it's all about discharge into the state's waterways. And so if you were to harvest right up to the shoreline, but not have a discharge of sediment, then I think you'd be okay. Yes, sir?
There are some towns that
right.
have zoning setbacks.
Yeah, I think
And
there
there has been proposed legislation for buffer areas.
Right, I think there's local requirements. The guide that's become, this is a book, Wetland, Woodland, Wildland. It's become, to a certain degree, it's become part of this use value appraisal program. So there's a ranking system that defines these natural communities that would then sort of heighten their resource value. And so it's interesting how this sort of public-private thing meshes together. The back of this book, has an appendix which describes natural community type, and then also as this book describes it, and then it has Vermont Non-Game and Natural Heritage Program community type, which, again, they're reflected as being, oftentimes the same community type. So this is sort of the guidebook for that. So another category of ESTA would include rare, threatened, endangered species. And so again, the common one here in Addison County is the Indiana bat. And so if you have habitat that is known or believed to be habitat that's suited to that bat, then that would be able to be put right into this ESTA category. Again, there's limitations. The legislature set limitations on the, how many acres you can enroll relative to your productive forest land, which again is like a debatable level. It also would follow with herbaceous plants, any rare, threatened, and endangered species. We've been through the riparian area thing, I think, fairly well. So that example that I gave at the mouth of Otter Creek, I think, is a good example of a riparian area ESTA. It probably falls into some other categories as well. And so again, this is one of those situations where previously these riparian areas had to be lumped in with adjacent land, whereas now they can be identified on the map as a specific polygon described in a forest management plan, and they can be then managed for the values that they present outside of timber management. Vernal pools would be another example of an ESTA. Again, fairly common throughout the county, oftentimes unknown to exist by landowners. Sometimes it's the perfect place in the winter time to put that hitch of logs, which then I try to help people understand that it might be better to direct the road somewhere else. Forested wetlands, this is yet the fifth example of an ESTA, and these exist, certainly in Addison County. Can someone tell me where these might occur? right here in Addison County? Cornwall Swamp. So all along the Otter Creek, basically from Middlebury south, and then certainly the other direction. Some prime examples of forested wetlands. And so again, this would be a ESTA categorization, which has limited enrollment the way the legislators have defined it now. Which again does lead me at time back to the wink and nod business. Old forest is the 6th category of an ESTA, so biologically mature forest. It's a place that has somehow escaped some stand replacing disturbance, which occurs, quite commonly. Just over the course of the last couple years, there's been several in Addison County. And so the old forest generally, again, I get into these situations where people are trying to define them or understand if they have that sort of thing, and it can be complicated, but there are some ecologists who are really good at defining this. The multiple age classes is one way that one sort of categorization or qualification that's very useful to use. And again, the complex structure, that what I mean by that is vertical structure. So the 4th category is lands not management for timber, but require some protective management. And so these things might be where you buried your dog or something like that. And so again, it's the way to sort of qualify these things that otherwise would be sort of left like, oh, geez, do I have to tell them about that, or not put it on the map or hide it somehow. 5th category of the ESTA. These are lands that not managed for timber. They just need to be mapped. And again, so this is that actual qualification of these categorizations, which previously was sort of off the radar. And it's very useful because we're starting to quantify these things as they exist. And again, it's like a voluntary thing, so people don't have to put these things in as these categories. But so these are, the Site 4 lands are non-productive soils. So they're not capable of producing 20 cubic feet per acre of wood per acre per year. And so it's, again, it falls, it's defined by that timber production. And so as it states, there's no cap or limit on enrollment so long as that the parcel has at least 20 acres enrolled as productive forest management. And so again, the legislatures were trying to make sure that some of that land would be part of our working landscape. So the open land category, these are, and the open land category means that these are lands that are not eligible under the ag program. So they're not to be reforested within 2 years, and they cannot exceed 20% of the enrolled forested acres on productive sites. And so that might be a land that is kept open, or it might be land that is open as a result of some cultural treatment historically, or due to some productive or non-productive character. And these lands are not taxed at the forest land rate. They're taxed at the ag rate, which is a little bit higher. So in all these circumstances that I've described, productive forest land, the ESTAs, all of that stuff, these things must be included. They must appear on an improved map like I showed you, and the requirements of the map, there are requirements for the mapping, and there's a fair amount of artistic or technical abilities in the drafting of the maps. But there are specific requirements. Generally, they're done by a private consulting forester or a GIS specialist. Rarely are they done by the landowner. So I'm going to get into a couple different things here quickly, which are sort of outside of the typical forest land program that I administer. This isn't really outside of that, but it's just something that I wanted to make sure that, again, the public understands. And so sugar bushes, especially right now where you'll start to see this happening, the sugaring industry is like exploding. I don't know if people are aware of that, but there's a lot of money being invested into sugaring operations. Statewide, New England, in Quebec, there's a lot of money being invested in it, which is always interesting sort of thing. Like with one thing I haven't talked about is like emerald ash borer and the Asian longhorn beetle. But it sort of makes me nervous for those landowners who are investing a lot of money into a sugar bush setup with these things out there that are like bad car ride with a load of firewood away, essentially, like the Asian longhorn beetle. And so, yes, sir.
Well, I think it's interesting in the last sentence there, consistent with sustainable forestry management, that's the first time that I've seen that word utilized in any of the language of the
Right.
program.
Yeah. I think you'll find, if I were to hand you the manual, you'd find it quite commonly in the, productive forest portion for timber. It's interesting. The other thing about this is that you can have sugar bush in the forest land program, and on the same application, you can have applying for agricultural land. Check all that apply. Cropland, hayland, orchard, sugar bush, Christmas trees, pasture. And so you can have a sugar bush that's enrolled as ag land. Higher appraisal, never have a forest management plan, never have a forest management activity report filed, never have an inspection by the county forester.
Isn't that a relic from when?
That's, whatever. It's interesting. It might be a relic, yeah. It might be, it was originally, it depends on who you talk to, how old the legislator is. There's some legislators who I talked to down in Paulet who said that, the whole forest land program was piggybacked on this thing. It was really intended to benefit farmers. And at the last minute, some of the southern 4 county legislators were like, whoa, what about us down here where there isn't a cow left? And they came up with this forest land program, essentially. And so again, that's like a story that I've heard. I'm take off my county forester hat before I say that sort of thing probably. But it is interesting to sort of see, it's been a long time. It's 3 decades, essentially, of this administration of this program, and things get lost. People retire, die, the decision makers or whatever are like gone somewhere less snowy or cold or whatever, and you try to unearth the thing somehow as to how that decision making was made. But so, this other thing, all taps shall be removed annually at the end of each sugaring season and before full leaf out, which is really sort of interesting thing. It's like, so just so you know, I don't do a lot of monitoring of this. I don't know. It's like, how the hell am I going to go and tell them, hey, you got to pull those taps? It's like, to me, it's like common sense. But again, it's a tricky thing. The sugar bush, it's like bubbling right now. The steam is starting to rise. And we're going to, it'll be interesting in the next 10, 20 years just to see how things sort of evolve around that. There's a lot of money being invested in sugar bush production, essentially. And I don't know. I get like that. I, see it, feel it, hear it, like that sort of rising thing. And then I'm like driving around in my car with pinned Asian longhorn beetles to show the elementary school kids. And I'm like, boy, I wouldn't want to be spending $50,000 on tubing and an evaporator and then have that thing arrive, Anyways, so 4 minutes. Originally, I was asked to, be part of like a discussion, I think, on biomass anyways. And I'm not a biomass expert, is what it comes down to. I interact with it. Like where I came from, Paulet, there was no biomass. It was too far to truck to BED. Rygate was too far away. There were no schools down there using biomass. It just didn't happen. I mean, we were always like yelling down there to the legislators, hey, what about us down here? It's like a tool in the toolbox for a forest manager to be able to sell that stuff if you can, or, manage for it. So I'm just going to go quickly into this. I talked a little bit, I think, about the AMPs. Did I bring that up? Seems like I did, yeah. And so those are, regulations. So in 1986, the legislature passed, amendment to and it's in that little orange book, and we're in the process, Forest and Parks is in the process of updating updating the book to make it more like user-friendly. We can't change the underlined portions of those AMPs because they are, part of rule-making, which would take a different process. But again, there's a lot of things that are like debatable, you can discuss them in good forest management. Silvicultural guides are based on a dichotomous key. If this, then that. If not, then the other thing. And so like a silvicultural guide for managing northern hardwoods, that document that I showed you, which is based in science in like really great places, you can have metrics that'll lead you to a long series of improvement cuts, cutting every 5 years for the next 20 years, trying to hold things together, or you could just clear cut the whole thing and start it all over again. So the same metrics could lead you on that dichotomous key to uneven age management, a long series of improvement cuts, or clear cut by, clear cutting, shelter wood cutting, or strip cutting. And so, again, from a scientific basis, measurements could lead you to these two things. And which is just sort of an interesting thing. The acceptable management practices just cover everything. If you've got wheels turning on your property, you got to protect the water quality. It is like held in public trust. And so I don't, as a county forester, I don't get too involved. If people want to do even age management, I might say, well, I don't think that's a good idea, but that's what they're going to do. If they ask my opinion, I'll give my opinion, but generally they have choices. They can make choices. The acceptable management practices, the bar is right here, and you got to get over it somehow. And I hold those standards really high. You got to keep the dirt out of the brook, basically. Keep it up on the hill. And so I hand out more of those little orange books. I just go through them. There's 4 or 5 logging contractors that I think have 7 of them underneath the seat of their truck, and I don't think they've ever opened them, which is the whole point. And I was like, come on, you guys. And so, this is the thing, is that as an administrator, you got to figure out what you're going to focus on, and that's one thing that I try to keep the bar high on. But the other legislation that was passed is this heavy cut law. So as it states here, a heavy cut is a harvest leaving a residual stocking level of acceptable growing stock below the sea line. And so these silvicultural guides, all of them have like a chart, basically, table, which has trees per acre and basal area, which is a measure of stocking or density of stems on an acre. And so these lines represent different stocking levels. And so this line here, the A line as it referred to, would be very high stocking. If it was on a hill and you had your telemark skis on, you'd want to make sure you were good at turning, because there'd be lots of things to ski around. The spaces might be small, so you want to be fast. At the B line stocking, you might be able to, look around, see if the sky's blue. At the sea line stocking, you could almost go anywhere you want, basically. There might be a lot of underbrush, and so you might get tangled in it because there'd probably be a lot of sunlight hitting the ground on that ski slope, essentially. And so these guides, this is for northern hardwoods. There's the same stocking guides for spruce fir, for any number of forest types. Again, here in the Northeast, northern hardwood types, which includes mixed wood, which might include a component of softwood, pine, spruce, fir, hemlock, falls into this category. So this is the stocking guide for hardwood. On the next page is mixed wood, which is 25 to 65% softwoods. Anyways, this is sort of like, near and dear to a lot of consulting foresters. This guy, Bill Leake, is still alive. He lives in New Hampshire, and he's like he's a lifelong U.S. Forest Service scientist. I think he wrote the first guide in '68 or something like that. And he's the kind of person who, like, when you talk to him, he's, he always says, like, well, it depends, and then he goes on. And the longer you practice forestry, the more you realize is that there's a whole lot of things that, like, depend. Anyways, and so heavy cut law, that might be another, again, the AMPs and the heavy cut law could be like whole nother topic, really. The heavy cut law is something that I run into periodically. And so it requires like application and map. It's not as involved as a use value appraisal map. And this is one of those things that when I receive this, I have 14 days to act on it. Otherwise, it's assumed to be approved by the person filing the heavy cut permit. And so it's not intended to be something where bureaucracy gets in the way. I can get in the way, but I just have to do it in a timely fashion. And this was actually initiated in part by what was happening in Addison County. It was also like the champion lands, I think, in the Northeast Kingdom that caused that legislation to happen. But there's a little piece of Granville, Vermont, which when I first got this job, I was told the first week that I was on that you have to go over to East Granville because there's the largest landowner in Addison County has a piece of land over there. It used to be Meadowy Lumber, which happened to be in Granville, New York, which is right across the border from Paulet where I lived, and I knew all the people that worked over there. And I knew the foresters that worked for Meadowy Lumber that owned this land. And anyways, I looked on the map, and I was like, oh, I didn't know I was like confused. And I looked at the map, I was home in Paulet. I was still living in Paulet, and I had to get to East Granville, Vermont. And I looked at the map, that night, and I was like, oh, shit, I got to drive to Rochester to get to Addison County. It's like crazy, it's like 12A, it's like middle of nowhere, and it's a remnant of 89, 89 made some of that land there sort of lonely.
Is that, was that land harvested for the plywood facility that was over there on 100?
Yeah, there was a lot of different, this is actually over the mountain from 100. And so it's if you going north on 100 past the Hancock plywood mill and look off to the northeast at the ridge line there, this would be on the other side of that. Yeah, and so it's not far from the plywood mill as the crow flies, but boy, oh boy, to get there. There's a part of that, if you look on a map sometime like the Gazetteer, there's a part of that Addison County in East Granville. When I was looking at the map trying to figure out how I was going to get there from Paulet, I was like, oh my gosh. It's called Lost Nation. So there's a little town, old abandoned town up there that's Lost Nation. And let me tell you, it is an incredible place. It's the other way to think about it is if you're driving south on 89, right after the ice storm, and look to the south and west at not the first ridge of mountains, but the second ridge of mountains that's way off in the background there that were like ragged, which is, you know, again, if you're driving north on Route 100 in like Hancock and Granville, it would be right up there. It's that same ridge, just from the other side. And that got just ravaged in the ice storm. And that led to then Meadowy Lumber doing a whole bunch of clear cuts that were visible from 89, which then, you know, things all went like kooky. And this heavy cut law, you know, people were like, you know, what are we going to do? Anyways, and so this is, again, this guide, you know, the legislation, and this is like one of those situations in my mind as a practicing forester that's like, holy cow, you know, you give like the legislature the idea that they're going to like somehow regulate forestry, and they come up with this language, and all of a sudden it becomes law. But these guides, you know, this guide isn't intended to be regulatory. This is like science-based guide, and it's not, like the intent of this wasn't to make things sort of black and white. And it's, you know, it's being used that way, and so it's really tricky to pull all those things together. Because again, this thing in the back of this, ultimately, it's a dichotomous key. And so, you know, stand prescription key, it says objective. So this is the section pole timber and saw timber stands, mean diameter of 4 inches or more. The first choice, which you have two number ones, right, because it's dichotomous, objective, uneven age management, or even age management. And so off you go. And so for the same metrics, you could choose, if you were a manager, and this is the whole intent of this thing, even age management, which would then lead you potentially to like J, which would be stocking of acceptable growing stock more than the C line on the stocking guide, which leads you to number 3, which might be stand mature, which then would lead you to number 4, which might be your objective would be intolerant and intermediate species, or the other number 4 is tolerant species, which would lead you, if you chose J, which your objective is intolerant or intermediate species, which might be like paper birch or yellow birch, compared to sugar maple or beech, which are intolerant of shade, you'd either get to J, which is apply clear cutting to maximize the proportion of intolerant and intermediate species, which is completely accurate from a scientific basis. Or you'd get K, use a light 2-cut shelterwood, leaving about 80% or more crown cover. You know, which is, again, it's like from the public's perspective, it might be like either like, oh, that's not so bad, or like, oh my God, what happened, you know? And the funny thing is I go up there now, you know, whatever it is, 12 years after the ice storm. Is that right? I don't even know. 80, yeah. Something like that, 88, 89, something like that. Anyways, it's been a long time. You know, in a certain way, it's been a long time, right? We can't even remember. But,
Yesterday.
you know, and also from a forest standpoint, I go up into these places, you know, where they chose Meadowy Lumber, you know, they chose K. No, they chose J, apply clear cutting. And I've been up into some of those places there, which then, you know, that activity, which you could see off, if you're driving south in 89, you would have looked over there and been like, oh my gosh, what's going on over there? You know, because it was like that ridge line, you know, the nice forest stand ridge line, and then it went right down to the ground, and, you know, it was like gone for miles, essentially, on that ridge line. And people were like, oh my gosh, what happened? And if you were the forest manager, it was like, well, what happened was our timber resource, they're a timber management company, was like decimated by the ice storm. So we salvaged what we could, essentially. You know, it was like a financial decision. But so I go back there now, and it is like unbelievable, the response. So this guide is about growing, you know, long-term management. which is outside of the scale of someone who might be like 50 years old looking at a forest that they remember for the last 50 years that's now no longer a forest. But in 50 more years, let me tell you that those forests up there on that land, you know, where they paid attention to the AMPs, they were in current use, they had to have all their AMPs in place, they kept the dirt up on the hill. You go up there now and it's like yellow birch, ash, sugar maple, thick, you know, you can barely get through it, you know, 15 years after that. And so again, I interact with a lot of people, some of whom can't believe what their neighbors are doing on their property. And I try to be compassionate about their concerns, understanding, but the reality is that, you know, things do come back, essentially. It might take some time. I don't think I usually bring this book. I'm going to stop talking here because I know it's late. But so, there's a book called The Nature of Vermont by Charles Johnson, who was the state naturalist for a long time. It's a really great book. You can find it, library. I could lend you a copy. Anyways, there's a chapter in it that says, the chapter is titled, People Come to Vermont. And it's about the history of European settlement, essentially, in Vermont. And the chapter starts, you know, with a quote, with two quotes. And the first quote is these fields, these hills, these mountains abound with resources aplenty. You know, acre and acre and acre of rich land filled with resources. That was Ira Allen in 1790. And then the next one is, we have now cut forest enough. Our rivers are filled with sediment. Our lakes are choked with debris. And that was George Perkins Marsh in 1850. 60 or 70 years of like, there wasn't any Husqvarna going, you know. It was 60 or 70 years of like rugged work. And we went from what Ira had seen, which of course he was a real estate developer really, to what George Perkins Marsh saw, which was like, you know, dirt in the brook. The AMPs were not followed, essentially. And so, you know, it's interesting to, you know, just keep those things. I always read that like to school groups and other people because, you know, our land here is, you know, it is what it is. It is both, you know, it is like simultaneously precious and sort of sensitive, while also freaking rugged and durable, you know? And so it's just a matter of like embracing all of those things and all that we ask from it, you know, sort of at the same time. Anyways, I'm going to stop. That's my contact information. I am a public servant, available to come periodically for, you know, whatever reason you might have. Sometimes people call me because they think they have the state record white oak, which they do. And us county foresters, we want to claim them if we can in our counties. Bragging rights, you know. I think it's like 88 inches in diameter. Oh my. Tree hugger. You can't hug it, you know, you gotta sort of love it, sort of in a different way. They're awesome, though. There's a few people who are big tree hunters, you know, and so we have a good time. They're persistent. Anyway, so thank you all. I appreciate it. I'm sorry
Thank you,
I kept
Chris.
you past
Thank you, Chris.
9 o'clock.